The Infinite Dial goes live in LA. The latest from our daily newsletter at podnews.net. This year's Infinite Dial will be presented at Podcast Movement Evolutions on March the 23rd. The research from Edison Research shows the total number of US adults who listen to podcasts. Among other things, it's sponsored this year by Wondery and Art19, and you'll be able to also watch online. The Podcast Hall of Fame 2022 honorees were announced, including Evo Terra, Molly Wood, Dr. Emily Morse and Dave Slusher, who, as our History of the Word Podcasts page discusses, was the first podcaster to mention the word podcast on his podcast.
iPod platform just doesn't, spring from the tongue. But what I'm doing right here, and what Adam's doing, and what Dave Weiner is doing, and what IT Conversations are doing, that's podcasting.
Congratulations to them all. The ceremony is on March the 25th at Podcast Movement Evolutions. Google Podcasts appears to have quietly removed their Google Play block tag from their documentation and, indeed, the entire Google Play RSS namespace. You're now told to use iTunes block to remove your podcast from all Google platforms too. Triton Digital has released its Australian podcast ranker for January. Casefile remains number 1. In publishers, Stitcher moves to number 2, but has around half the monthly listeners of ARN's iHeart Podcast Network Australia, who remain number 1 for podcasts. The Cyberwire has added a new podcast to its network. Relativity's Security Sandbox starts its second season as part of the Cyberwire podcast network. We're promised a series of creatively driven conversations about what it takes to solve complex data problems. And Evergreen Podcasts is partnering with Sound Talent Media's 25 shows. Evergreen now has over 130 podcasts over 4 branded networks. And we will be at Podcast Movement Evolutions in Los Angeles in mid-March, and we're looking forward to meeting you. And in podcast news, Poscar is a new podcast about podcasting, mainly targeting productions in Spanish from Latin America and Spain. A fortnightly podcast, it's just launched with an introduction and an episode all about podcast awards. It's hosted by Pablo Fischer, and because I pronounced it badly, it's spelt P-O-S-C-A-R. And that's the latest from our newsletter. For all the links, we're at podnews.net.